Hello children. Today we are going to do a new chapter from Echoes, a collection of ISC short stories. The name of the chapter is The Sound Machine, written in 1949 by Roald Dahl, a British novelist, short story writer, poet, screenwriter and fighter pilot. The Sound Machine is a story which combines science fiction with conversation in a fantastic tale that hovers between illusion and reality. First and foremost, we get to know the weather of the place where all the events or incidents will be unfolding. Which season is it? It is warm summer. What phase of the date is it? It is evening. Then we are introduced to the main character of the story. His name is Klosner. The Sound Machine. It was a warm summer evening and Klosner walked quickly through the front gate and around the side of the house and into the garden at the back. He went on down the garden until he came to a wooden shed and he unlocked the door, went inside and closed the door behind him. So here we are introduced to Klosner first, who is the main protagonist of the story. The interior of the shed was an unpainted room. Against one wall on the left, there was a long wooden workbench, and on it, among a littering of wires and batteries and small sharp tools, there stood a black box about 3 feet long, the shape of a child's coffin. Here we are given the description of inside the shed of Klosner, and then they have said that there was a long wooden bench and the wires were spread out in an untidy manner. Wires, batteries, tools, very sharp tools, and there was also a black box about 3 feet long. Klosner moved across the room to the box. The top of the box was open, and he bent down and began to poke and peer inside it among a mass of different colored wires and silver tubes. So he went and started rummaging in it. He picked up a piece of paper that lay beside the box, studied it carefully, put it down, peered inside the box and started running his fingers along the wires, tugging gently at them to test the connections, glancing back at the paper, then into the box, then at the paper again, checking each wire. He did this for perhaps an hour. Tugging gently at them means he was pulling hard at them. That means he went on and on pulling, tucking at the wires again, looking at the paper. He had written something on it, maybe some instructions. So he was looking at it for about an hour. Then he put a hand around to the front of the box where there were 3 dials and he began to twiddle them. Twiddle them means turn them nervously, watching at the same time the movement of the mechanism inside the box. All the while he kept speaking softly to himself, nodding his head, smiling sometimes, his hands always moving, the fingers moving swiftly, deftly. Deftly means very skillfully. Inside the box, his mouth twisting into curious shapes when a thing was delicate or difficult to do, saying yes, yes, and now this one, yes, yes, but is this right? Is it? Where's my diagram? So he was talking to himself and smiling to himself. Ah, yes, of course. Yes, yes, that's right. And now, good, good. Yes, 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 yes. Whatever he was doing, he was very fixed on it. His concentration was intense. His movements were quick. There was an air of urgency about the way he worked, of breathlessness, of strong, suppressed excitement. So whatever he was doing, he was very excited about it. He was just concentrating on the box wires. Suddenly he heard footsteps on the gravel path. Gravel? Small stones. outside, and he straightened and turned swiftly as the door opened and a tall man came in. It was Scott. It was only Scott, the doctor. Now, as he was working, he heard someone walking on the gravel path outside, and suddenly the door opened and Dr. Scott came in. Well, well, the doctor said, "So this is where you hide yourself in the evenings." "Hello, Scott," Klausner said. "I happened to be passing," the doctor told him, "so I dropped in to see how you were. There was no one in the house, so I came on down here. How's that throat of yours been behaving?" So here we come to know that Dr. Scott seems to be a little concerned about Klausner. "It's all right. It's fine. Now I'm here, I might as well have a look at it. Please don't trouble. I'm quite cured. I am fine." This is what Klausner says. The doctor began to feel the tension in the room. He looked at the black box on the bench. Black box, a complicated kind of equipment. Then he looked at the man. "You have got your hat on?" he said. So all this while, Klausner was working with his hat on and he was not aware of it. "Oh, have I?" Klausner reached up, removed the hat and put it on the bench. The doctor came up closer and bent down to look into the box. "What's this?" he said, "making a radio?" "No, just fooling round. It's got rather complicated looking innards." Innards? Inner parts of a machine. So here the doctor says the inner part of the machine looks very complicated. Yes, Klausner seemed tense and distracted. Distracted means a little diverted. "What is it?" the doctor asked. "It's rather frightening looking thing, isn't it?" "It's just an idea." "Yes, it has to do with sound, that's all." "Good heavens! Man, don't you get enough of that sort of thing all day in your work?" "I like sound." This is what Klausner says. "So it seems." The doctor went to the door, turned and said, "Well, I won't disturb you. Glad your throat's not worrying you anymore." But he kept standing there, looking at the box, intrigued by the remarkable complexity of its inside. Intrigued means he was getting interested. Intrigued by the remarkable complexity of its inside, curious to know what this strange patient of his was up to, what's it really for, he asked. "You have made me inquisitive." Inquisitive means curious. "You have made me curious, Klausner." Klausner looked down at the box, then at the doctor, and he reached up and began gently to scratch the lobe of his right ear. There was a pause. The doctor stood by the door, waiting, smiling. "All right, I'll tell you. If you were interested." There was another pause, and the doctor could see that Klausner was having trouble about how to begin. He was shifting from one foot to the other, tugging at the lobe of his ear, looking at his feet, and then at last, slowly he said, "Well, it's like this. The theory is very simple, really. The human ear, you know that it can't hear everything. There are sounds that are so low-pitched or so high-pitched that it can't hear them." "Yes," the doctor said, "yes." "Well, speaking very roughly, any note so high that it has more than 15,000 vibrations a second, we can't hear it. Dogs have better ears than us. You know, you can buy a whistle whose note is so high-pitched that you can't hear it at all. But a dog can hear it." "Yes, I have seen one," the doctor said. "Of course you have. And up the scale, higher than the note of that whistle, there is another note, a vibration if you like. But I prefer to think it as a note. You can't hear that one either. And above that, there is another and another rising right up the scale forever and ever and ever, an endless succession of notes, an infinity of notes. There is a note, if only our ears could hear it, so high that it vibrates 1,000,000 times a second, and another 1,000,000 times as high as that, and on, higher and higher, as far as numbers go, which is infinity, eternity, beyond the stars. So there are certain sounds, Klausner informs the doctor, that human ear cannot hear. Klausner was becoming more animated. Animated means lively. He was becoming more lively every moment. He was a small, frail man, frail, thin, nervous and twitchy, with always moving hands. His large head inclined towards his left shoulder, as though his neck were not quite strong enough to support it rigidly. Rigidly means stiffly. His face was smooth and pale, almost white, and the pale grey eyes that blinked and peered from behind a pair of steel spectacles were bewildered, unfocused, remote. Bewildered means confused. He was a frail, nervous, twitchy little man, a moth of a man, dreamy and distracted. Suddenly, fluttering and animated. Fluttering means moving quickly. And now the doctor, looking at the strange pale face and those pale grey eyes, felt that somehow there was about this little person, a quality of distance, of immense, immeasurable distance, as though the mind were far away from where the body was. As if his mind and his body were not connected at all. The doctor waited for him to go on. Klausner sighed and clasped his hands tightly together. I believe, he said, speaking more slowly now, that there is a whole world of sound about us all the time that we cannot hear. It is possible that up there in those high-pitched, inaudible regions, there is a new exciting music being made. Inaudible, something which is not loud enough to be heard. With subtle harmonies and fierce grinding discords. Discords, a combination of musical notes that actually do not sound pleasure together. A music so powerful that it would drive us mad if only our ears were tuned to hear the sound of it. There may be anything. For all we know, there may. Yes, the doctor said, but it's not very probable. Why not? Why not? Klausner pointed to a fly sitting on a small roll of copper wire on the workbench. You see that fly? What sort of a noise is that fly making now? None that one can hear. But for all we know, the creature may be whistling like mad on a very high note, or barking, or croaking, or singing a song. Because it's got a mouth, hasn't it? It's got a throat. The doctor looked at the fly and he smiled. He was still standing by the door with his hand on the doorknob. Well, he said, so you are going to check up on that. You are going to see what this fly is making sound, what type of sound this fly is making, producing. Some time ago, Klausner said, I made a simple instrument that proved to me the existence of many odd, inaudible sounds. Often I have sat and watched the needle of my instrument recording the presence of sound vibrations in the air when I myself could hear nothing. And those are the sounds I want to listen to. I want to know where they come from and who or what is making them. So here we come to know that Klausner wants to invent a sound machine. And that machine on the table there, the doctor said, is that going to allow you to hear these noises? It may, who knows? So far I have had no luck, but I have made some changes in it. And tonight I am ready for another trial. This machine. he said, touching it with his hands, is designed to pick up to pick up sound vibrations that are too high pitched for reception by the human ear and to convert them to a scale of audible tones. I tune it in almost like a radio. So we come to know Klausner is a sort of scientist. How do you mean? It isn't complicated. Say I wish to listen to the squeak of a bat. Squeak, high sound. That's a fairly high-pitched sound, about 30,000 vibrations a second. The average human ear can't quite hear it. Now, if there were a bat flying around this room and I tuned in to 30,000 on my machine, I would hear the squeaking of that bat very clearly. I would even hear the correct note, F sharp or B flat or whatever it might be, but merely at a much lower pitch. Don't you understand? The doctor looked at the long black coffin box. And you are going to try it tonight? Klausner says yes. Well, I wish you luck. He glanced at his watch. My goodness, he said. I must fly. I must fly means I must go. Goodbye and thank you for telling me. I must call again sometime and find out what happened. The doctor went out and closed the door behind him. For a while longer, Klausner fussed about with the wires in the black box. So the doctor had gone. Klausner paid more attention. He was fussing around with the wires in the small complicated box. Then he straightened up and in a sort excited whisper said, now we'll try again. We'll take it out into the garden this time. And then perhaps, the reception will be better. Lift it up now, carefully. Oh my God, it's heavy. Now he's talking to himself. He carried the box to the door, found that he couldn't open the door without putting it down, carried it back, put it on the bench, opened the door, and then carried it with some difficulty into the garden. He placed the box carefully on a small wooden table that stood on the lawn. He returned to the shed and fetched a pair of earphones. He plugged the wire connections from the earphones into the machine and put the earphones over his ears. The movements of his hands were quick and precise. Precise means accurate. He was excited and breathed loudly and quickly through his mouth. He kept on talking to himself with little words of comfort and encouragement as though he were afraid that the machine might not work and afraid also of what might happen if it did. So he was going to experiment his machine out in the garden. He stood there in the garden beside the wooden table, so pale, small and thin that he looked like an ancient consumptive. Consumptive means a person who is suffering from a disease of the lungs. Bespectacled child. The sun had gone down. There was no wind, no sound at all. From where he stood, he could see over a low fence into the next garden, and there was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. He watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on its front. He put his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on the knob that moved a needle across a large central dial like the wavelength dial of a radio. The dial was marked with many numbers in a series of bands, starting at 15,000 and going on up to 1 million. And now he was bending forward over the machine. His head was cocked to one side in a tense, listening attitude. Cocked means raised at a vertical angle. His right hand was beginning to turn the knob. The needle was traveling slowly across the dial, so slowly he could hardly see it move, and in the earphones he could hear a faint, spasmodic crackling. Spasmodic means something that is happening at short intervals. Behind this crackling sound, he could hear a distant humming tone, which was the noise of the machine itself, but that was all. As he listened, he became conscious of a curious sensation, a feeling that his ears were stretching out away from his head, that each ear was connected to his head by a thin, stiff wire like a tentacle, and that the wires were lengthening, that the ears were going up and up toward a secret and forbidden territory, a dangerous ultrasonic region where ears had never been before and had no right to be. Ultrasonic means sounds that are pitched higher for the humans to hear. The little needle crept slowly across the dial, and suddenly he heard a shriek, a frightful, piercing shriek, and he jumped and dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. He stared around him as if expecting to see the person who had shrieked. There was no one in sight except one woman in the garden next door, and it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. Again it came, a throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. The note itself possessed a minor metallic quality that he had never heard before. Klausner looked around him, searching instinctively for the source of the noise. The woman next door was the only living thing in sight. He saw her reach down, take a rose stem in the fingers of one hand and snip the stem with a pair of scissors. Again he heard the scream. It came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. At this point, the woman straightened up, put the scissors in the basket with the roses, and turned to walk away. Mrs. Saunders, Klausner shouted, his voice shrill with excitement. Oh, Mrs. Saunders. We'll finish here, children, and we'll continue this story in the next video. Thank you.